what happens to the Ukrainian army over time. In other words, let's assume that the Ukrainian army begins to collapse in the Donetsk area or in the Donbass, and the Russians begin to push toward the Dnieper. What does that mean for Russian forces in other regions? Do you have a near total collapse of the Ukrainian military? Is it a partial collapse? Where do they retreat to? What do the defensive lines look like? I've never believed that the Russians were going to try to win a decisive victory. In other words, a victory where they conquered all of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. I believe you will end up with the Ukrainian rump state, and that Ukrainian rump state will have a military. But the question is, how much damage is going to be done to the overall Ukrainian army in the next month or 2 or 3? And what does that mean in terms of Ukraine keeping hold of places like Odessa and Kharkiv and other oblasts in between? If you're the Russians and you listen to the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Keith Kellogg's of the world talk, it seems to me that the lesson that you take from that is you better grab as much territory as you can. You better make sure that remaining Ukrainian rump state is as crippled as possible, because they're going to try to cause trouble for you for the foreseeable future. And the best way you minimize the amount of trouble that Ukrainian rump state can take is to take as much territory as possible, certainly to take areas like Odessa and Kharkiv. So I think just how this all plays out in the next couple months in terms of how extensive the collapse of the Ukrainian army will be is of great importance. The glide bomb issue is of enormous importance because the Russians have huge numbers of glide bombs. They're deadly effective. And furthermore, the Ukrainians have virtually no glide bombs. When we talk about artillery, the Russians have artillery, the Ukrainians have artillery. We can talk about the balance of artillery between the two sides. When you talk about glide bombs, one side has them, and that's the Russians, and they are deadly effective. And again, you want to remember, you have to combine those glide bombs with drones and with artillery. And this means that those Ukrainian forces that are moving about on the ground are vulnerable. But again, to go back to the Russian side, it is very important to emphasize that the Russians are mobilizing more and more forces every month. And the number of forces that the Russians have available to wage this war against Ukraine are increasing by the month, not decreasing. There's all this talk in the West about the Russians losing massive numbers of troops. And if you took this stuff seriously, you'd think the Russians have hardly any troops left to wage their offensive with. But this is poppycock. The Russians have lots of forces, and they've actually been deploying the forces that they have over the past year or so quite carefully so as to minimize the number of casualties. So again, the overall force balance is shifting. The overall force balance is shifting against the Ukrainians, who are now out in the open. And furthermore, the force-to-space ratio problem, which is disastrous at the moment, gets worse with the passage of time. So it's just a question of how long it takes the Russians to penetrate the front lines and encircle these Ukrainian forces and push on to the Dnieper. What's happening here is that the Ukrainians don't have sufficient manpower. To put it in slightly more pointed terms, they don't have sufficient infantry forces to man the lines of defense. They have huge, what we call force-to-space ratio problems. They have small number of troops holding lengthy pieces of the front line. And the end result is that allows the Russians to penetrate. And it's just very important to understand that the Ukrainians simply don't have the troops to rectify that problem. So the Russians are invariably going to make more breakthroughs. The reason that they're making these major league penetrations now for the first time in this war is in large part because the force-to-space ratio problem has gotten so serious for the Ukrainians. And again, it can't be fixed. Now you say they're sending reinforcements. The problem is once the war becomes fluid like this, everybody's out in the open. You're moving. And the distinction between defense and offense begins to melt away, right? In most of the war, what we've seen is that the defender was down in the ground or in a forested area, somewhat protected, and it was the offender that was moving. The situation you're now moving into when you begin to move reinforcements into this very fluid situation is the distinction between offense and defense disappears, and lots of those Ukrainian forces are moving about on the ground. And that means they're big fat targets for the artillery, the drones, and the glide bombs that the Russians have in huge numbers. So what I think is going to happen here is that as this battle goes on, there's going to be more and more attrition on the Ukrainian side. Of course, there'll be attrition on the Russian side, but I'll address that in a second. There's going to be more and more attrition on the Ukrainian side, and that's going to exacerbate the force-to-space ratio problem because the two ratios are related. The overall balance of forces is related to the force-to-space ratio issue. And as the Russians wear down the Ukrainian forces, they've decreased the number of available Ukrainian forces. That means that Ukraine's force-to-space ratio problem just gets worse and worse. Now, if you transition to the Russian side, first of all, the Russians have a huge advantage in firepower. So that means they'll end up killing more Ukrainians than Ukrainians kill Russians. There is zero evidence that Putin is interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There is zero evidence that he is interested in conquering countries in Eastern Europe. I just don't understand how these people can make this argument. Where is the evidence? I want them to show me where Putin said, I want to conquer all of Ukraine and incorporate it into a greater Russia. Where did he say that? He said it nowhere. Furthermore, as you and I both know very well, Danny, he would be out of his mind to try to conquer all of Ukraine because the western half of that country is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate Russians and would put up great resistance. He would need a huge army to occupy western Ukraine, and that army would be up to its eyeballs in alligators trying to deal with all of that resistance. He's going to have his hands full just trying to reintegrate the eastern portion of Ukraine that he ends up conquering into Russia. That's not going to be easy. He's going to have all sorts of problems. Just think about all the destruction that has been inflicted on that region that's going to become part of Russia. It's very great. So he's not going to try to conquer all of Ukraine. And he's never said that he would. And again, the same thing is true with Eastern Europe. But we have all these people in the West who continue to talk without evidence about Putin's ardent desire to basically reconstitute the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. We're going to be doing everything we can in the West to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine or in those areas of Ukraine that it incorporates into Russia. And the Russians are going to be doing everything they can to cause trouble in Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine remains a dysfunctional rump state. They're going to do everything they can to sow dissension in the transatlantic relationship, to sow dissension in Europe. I have no doubt about this. And I also, as I've said on the show, think there are potential flashpoints in places like the Arctic, Kaliningrad, the Baltic Sea, Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea for trouble to break out. So I understand all of that. But that's very different than saying that the Russians are bent on conquering all of Ukraine or conquering territory in East Europe. I don't think they're going to do that. Again, I think they're going to build up their defenses. They'd be foolish not to. They're dealing with a highly aggressive West, and they're dealing with a Ukraine that's going to want to restore the pre-2014 borders. So they'll spend a lot of money building up their defenses. And again, we'll have poisonous relations between the two sides. And this is regrettable, but this is where we're headed. There's no preparation for this meeting. It's not like the two sides had been working hard to figure out how to solve the problem. They had come to a rough agreement on what to do, and then they were just going to get together and consummate the deal. That's not what happened here. What happened is that Trump foolishly put himself in a position where he had to put secondary sanctions on Russia on August 8th. And he quickly understood that this was not something he wanted to do. So the question is, how do you back out of this situation that you've gotten yourself into? And there was a very simple solution to that. He sent Witkoff scurrying off to Moscow to meet with Putin and to ask for a meeting. The West likes to make the argument, Zelensky likes to make the argument that it was Putin who desperately wanted this meeting. On the contrary, it was Trump who desperately wanted the meeting because he wanted to avoid having to put sanctions on Russia on August 8th. So he got his meeting. Again, there's no preparation for it. There's no way the two sides can reach any sort of agreement. But you want to remember that the goal here of secondary sanctions is to punish the Russians by getting India to stop importing all of this Russian oil. That's the goal. And India has made it unequivocally clear that it is not going to stop importing Russian oil. And we've already learned that he cannot put the crosshairs on China because it has huge leverage over us because it controls all sorts of things that we need. So he couldn't go after the Chinese. It was easier to go after India. So even if he hurts India somewhat, he's not hurting Russia because India is not going to stop importing Russian oil. So it's all for naught. And he, of course, understands this. The fact is that secondary sanctions is not a meaningful threat against Russia. But this is an opportunity for Putin to show the world that he is a reasonable statesman and that he can meet with Trump and he can talk in a civilized and smart manner. It's also an opportunity for him to explain to President Trump in person exactly what his demands are and why those demands are in large part non-negotiable. It seems to me that President Trump has not gotten the word on what real Russian demands are. And this is an opportunity for Putin to tell Trump about those demands. So it's a nice situation for Putin. And by the way, he gets to come to the United States. He's putting his feet in American territory, and that works to his political advantage at home and abroad. So Putin is not going to lose here, in my opinion, and therefore I think it made good sense for him to accept the invitation. Again, I don't know what to say about our understanding of the Russian position. This is all just crazy. The Russians have made their position clear. Zelensky, the Europeans, and by the way, we don't talk much about this, but large chunks of the American national security establishment agree with Zelensky and with the Europeans. And they refuse to make any concessions to the Russians. And if they don't make any concessions to the Russians and they continue to demand a ceasefire and the Russians say there's not going to be a ceasefire, you're just going nowhere. And that's where we are. You can play all these clips from all these people saying these nonsensical things, but you end up in the same place, nowhere. What I find amazing here is that the Russians laid out their basic position. Putin laid out the Russians' basic position on June 14th of 2024. And nothing has changed since then. And he and his colleagues in Russia have repeated those positions time after time. And yet the West seems incapable of understanding what the Russian position is. And they keep demanding a ceasefire, for example, and the Russians have said there will be no ceasefire until you accept their basic demands. But nevertheless, the West continues to insist on a ceasefire, and it continues to pretend that it really doesn't know exactly what those demands are. I don't understand what's going on here. And again, why even have this meeting? What is the purpose of this meeting other than to get President Trump out of the pickle that he put himself in? There's just no point in it. They don't agree on the basics of a settlement. And if you don't agree on the basics of a settlement, why have this meeting? I think it's important to understand that Trump had a honeymoon period. It lasted a couple months. And I think we're now past the honeymoon period. And I think people are beginning to look at what Trump has accomplished. And on the foreign policy front, he's been largely unsuccessful, especially with regard to settling the Ukraine war. You remember he said before he was even in the White House that he was going to shut this one down, maybe before he moved in, but certainly right after he moved in. And not only has he not shut it down, but he's facing a real problem. We haven't talked about this, but events on the battlefield are turning against Ukraine. And one can only wonder what the situation on the battlefield will look like on Friday when the two leaders get together and what the consequences of that will be for their meeting. The Ukrainians, and we can get into this, of course, are really in bad shape. The Russians are doing very well on the battlefield, unexpectedly. And this, I think, will put Putin in an even stronger position on Friday than we anticipated a week ago. So the Europeans are buying weaponry from us, right? They're getting American weaponry. It's just that the Europeans are buying it, they're paying for it, and they're giving it to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are not going to run out of weaponry because once the Biden pipeline dries up, there'll be no Trump pipeline. There will be a Trump pipeline through the Europeans. What has screwed the Ukrainians big time is not the weapons problem. They do have a weapons deficit for sure, but the real problem is a manpower deficit. They have run out of infantry. They have run out of trigger pullers. And the end result is they don't have sufficient forces to thickly populate the front lines. When you're in a war of attrition and you have two armies standing toe to toe, if you're the defender like the Ukrainians are, you have to thickly populate the front lines. You have to have lots of troops up there to parry the offensives by the Russians. And the problem is that the Ukrainians are so short of manpower that they can't populate the line in any meaningful way. And that presents the Russians with all sorts of opportunities to penetrate the defensive position of the Ukrainians. From the very beginning, Trump was playing a very difficult hand on Ukraine and on other issues when he walked into the White House on January 20th. That meant that he had to be very strategic. He had to be very cunning, very smart about how to deal with all those people that you were just describing. But did he behave in a strategically smart way? Did he calculate how best to negotiate through these obstacle-filled waters? Of course not. He did none of that. He just thought he could fly by the seat of his pants and get by. And the end result is he has lost to those different foreign policy establishments.